We're diving in kind of full bore now into our Rotten Tomatoes series. We've spent the last 7 weeks exploring the story of the gospel and of what that is all about. And basically, here's what happens. When we, as Christ followers, think about the story of the gospel or talk about it with other people, inevitably, questions come up. Hard, difficult issues come up for ourselves and also for other people that we know, friends or family. And we're calling these hard, difficult questions, they're like rotten tomatoes. They come into our hands and it's like we want to toss them at the story. What about this? Okay, I get the story about God's mission of grace and justice to redeem and rescue our world. But what about this? This is all based on the Bible. You really take the Bible seriously? Come on. And what do you mean about people of other religions? These are the 4 issues that we're going to head towards in the series. What about people of other religions? Does this mean that everyone else is just dead wrong about everything? What about the gay and lesbian community? Why has there been so much tension and conflict there? What about this whole idea of hell? Isn't that just mean and sadistic? Great questions. They're great questions, and we just want to move right towards them for the next 4 weeks here. And so here's why we're doing this. There are many religious communities where asking difficult questions like posing challenges to what we believe, it's not encouraged. There are many religious communities where that kind of question asking is even suppressed with the phrase, well, just have faith, just believe. I completely disagree. In my mind, no belief or worldview is worth holding if you can't poke and prod and challenge and question to determine whether it's hogwash or whether there's really something to it. We should encourage and foster a culture of question asking in a community of Christ followers, because questioning and challenging means that we're engaged, that we're thinking things through. And so that's what we're doing in this series. We're just going to move right towards some of these issues here. Faith is believing something because there are good reasons to believe in the first place. And that's what we're going to be exploring in this series. And we actually want you all to participate in this series. We want to hear your questions, your challenges, and your responses. So we set up 2 ways for you all to ask your own questions. One, we set up a text messaging number. So get out your phones, your smartphones or whatever, if you have them with you. And each week, during the service, as the kind of message goes on and we're moving towards these issues, send in your questions. And we're going to collect them throughout the service. There's somebody who's doing that. Send them to this number. One small detail as you get out your phones, you need to begin your message with this little phrase, I ask. So I space ask, and then your question. I ask, why do you think the Bible is true? I ask, why does Tim talk so fast sometimes? I ask, why does, So it's a little registration code that makes everything work for the software. So that's one way. Send your questions, beginning with I ask, to this number. Look in your bulletin, and you have the info right there in front of you. Also, if you want to send it in during the service. Second way, if you don't have a phone, we have the old-fashioned way. Out at the sign-up registration table out in the atrium, we have a little place, this Rotten Tomatoes. We have pens and paper. Write down your questions, put it in the box. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to field and kind of collect all of those throughout each day of the series. And then tonight, and every night, Sunday night of the series, at 7:30 p.m., we're going to have a live Q&A panel consisting of the speaker, either me or Chris, and some other people. And we're going to address the questions that you all have been sending in. So if you don't send anything in, it's going to be really boring. So engage. Get your phones out, get your questions out, put your thinking caps on, and we want to engage with what you all are thinking about these topics. Is that all clear? Okay, great. So here we go. Let's dive in to topic number 1. Isn't the Bible kind of a joke? Everything we've been doing the last 7 weeks, the story of the gospel, we've been looking at the story of the scriptures, essentially. So you're telling me that you're going to base your whole worldview and what you think about life, the meaning of life, and all that on the basis of this ancient book. Right. Do you also believe in unicorns? You know what I'm saying? Like, what? Are you kidding me? This is the modern world in this ancient book, and you're gonna base everything on that. It's a great question. It's an excellent question. What I'm going to do is actually kind of narrow the question down even a little more and focus specifically on the core, central story of the gospel, which is the stories about Jesus of Nazareth, of his life and death and resurrection. I'm not even trying to do the whole Bible in the time that we have here. Let's just focus on the stories about Jesus in the New Testament. We have 4 of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament. They're not the only stories and information about Jesus we have. There are other stories or collections of Jesus' teaching outside the New Testament. They come from much later period. There are other places or people who mention Jesus outside of the Bible, but these 4, they're the earliest that we have accounts of Jesus. And what I want to do is explore and just camp out on these. Are these narratives true? Is it reasonable to believe that they actually tell us something that actually happened in Jesus of Nazareth? This is not an idle question in my culture. Who read the Da Vinci Code? Or saw the movie at least? Okay, all right. You don't have to be bashful. I thought it was a great story. Guys, that book and movie put the question on the front burner in our culture in recent years. And it's there in a million other ways, on the History Channel or corny like Nova specials or whatever. Another example, a kind of prominent comedian and talk show host, Bill Maher, recently put out a very clever and witty kind of satirical documentary called Religulous. And in it, he's just kind of lambasting religion of all sorts, especially Christianity. And in this little scene we're going to watch, he's interviewing a prominent American scientist who is also a Christ follower, and he just puts all the basic questions on the table. Let's watch the interview here. All right, thank you, Bill Maher. Now, whatever you think about how fairly that interview was edited, that's another question altogether. But, there you go. There you go. It's out there. The question is out there, and all of the key questions are right there on the table. Do we have any evidence or reason to believe that the New Testament Gospels actually connect us to eyewitness testimony about Jesus? In Bill Maher's opinion? No. So what's going on there? Do we have any reason to believe that the extraordinary stories about what Jesus did go back to eyewitness testimony about him and so on? So here's what I'd like to do with the small time that we have here today is explore and kind of put out there my questions that have kind of helped me on my journey in exploring this issue. This is nothing like a definitive statement on these questions. Really, I just want to get the conversation started and stir the pot. Question: do the New Testament Gospels actually preserve eyewitness testimony about what Jesus said and did? Or are they much later legends or fabrications about him? Here's why Bill Maher thinks what he does about the Gospels. You see a little timeline right here. And Jesus is a stick man. Why not? I'm sure he was a skinny guy. He walked a lot. He passed from the scene. Jesus passes from the scene, roughly around like 30 AD or so. When do the Gospels come into existence? In the 70s and the 90s of the first century. So we've got a gap here. Pretty big gap, 40 to 60 years. Now, on the face of it, that seems pretty intimidating. That's a long time. It's a long time. If I were to what's your name? Larry? Okay, let's say if I was to go to Larry and whisper in his ear, Peter Piper picked a pack of pickled peppers or something like that, right? And he had one chance to whisper it to the next person. By the time I got all the way to the back, do you think it'd be the same thing? Probably. Have you guys ever played this game? It's telephone. Now, what if it was 60 years of telephone? You know what I mean? That's a pretty intimidating gap. This is why Bill Maher says the things that he says. Problem. This is really just an inaccurate way of thinking about how the Gospels were put together. This is not how things went down. It went down totally differently, and we actually know exactly how the Gospels were made and how this process worked out. Why don't you grab a Bible and look with me at the Gospel of Luke. Luke chapter 1. If you're using brown Bibles here, It's on page 723, Luke 1. This is a unique little paragraph here that we're going to look at. Luke has essentially told us, before he starts the narrative about Jesus, he speaks to the reader. And he tells us about how he made the book that you're about to read. This is fascinating. And I apologize, the NIV translation is actually pretty clunky English here, so we'll just kind of work our way through it. We'll start right at the beginning. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Okay, pause. So what are the things fulfilled among us? He's talking about the story about Jesus. Many people have already put together accounts of what happened with Jesus. Where did those accounts come from? Who are the people making these accounts? He tells us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were what? Were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So notice what he's saying here. He's saying there already exist, before Luke, accounts about Jesus that come directly from the eyewitnesses. In other words, what he's saying is there aren't accounts out there floating around that are 4, 5, 6, 7 steps removed from the eyewitnesses like a game of telephone. He's saying there's accounts that already exist that are being consolidated and passed on by the first generation of Christ followers themselves, the people who were there with him. So, let's keep reading. He says, therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. He's dedicating this book to a friend named Theophilus, probably somebody who was like his financial sponsor, who like funded his study leave so he could go research and write the book. I'm not joking. I need to find a friend like that. So what's he saying? He's saying, I sat down and investigated all of these accounts and consulted with the eyewitnesses and put together my own account. Now look what he's saying here. Is Luke responsible for the material in the book of Luke? Is Luke an eyewitness? He's not an eyewitness. He was not among that first circle of Christ followers. But is he claiming that the material in the book comes from himself? Is he claiming that? No, he's not claiming that. Where does he say his material comes from? From the accounts that come directly from the eyewitnesses. So it's a mistake to say that because Luke wrote his gospel 40 to 60 years after, that the material in the gospel is 40 to 60 years after Jesus. Maybe a metaphor will help. This is a quilt that belongs to my wife, Jessica. Her great-grandmother made this quilt, best we can guess, in around 1930. So it's like almost 80 years old. Beautiful, beautifully preserved. Okay, now when we say that someone makes a quilt, do we mean that Jessica's great-grandmother went to the cotton fields, picked the cotton, did whatever you do to cotton to make it into fabric, dyed it, cut it up into pieces, and put the quilt together? Is that what we mean when we say someone makes a quilt? No, not unless you're, not unless you're that kind of person. So most of us aren't, okay? So, most of us go to the store and we get material that already exists. And making a quilt is really just rearranging material that already exists into a beautiful shape like this. So Jessica's great-grandmother, something like this, you could see. Say this like yellow material here. This already existed before the quilt. Who knows? Like maybe it had been sitting in the back of the fabric store for 5 years, and they're like, oh, okay, let's get this out on the shelf. And Jessica's great-grandmother bought it. In other words, the date of the quilt does not determine the age of the materials the quilt is made out of. Are you guys tracking with me? Okay? The material is older than the quilt. This is precisely what Luke is telling us about how he put his account together. The arranging of Luke's quilt was about 40 to 60 years after Jesus, but the materials go directly to the source. Do you see how this works here? Okay, so this is exactly what's going on with the Gospels. Okay, now this is even cooler. We actually know where Luke got a big chunk of his quilt pieces that is in Luke's Gospel. He had the Gospel of Mark. Have you ever read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first three Gospels, if you have, and recognize they have like all this material that's the same. They overlap in big ways. That's because Luke has drawn upon Mark and incorporated Mark into his quilt and then accessed other eyewitnesses to arrange and have more material. So this begs the question, Mark is the first and earliest gospel. Where did Mark get his quilt pieces from? And he tells us too, but in a little more subtle way. Go, if you have Luke still open, and you've got Mark there in front of you, go to the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 1. It's on page 707 of the Bibles you've got here. Okay, Mark, so it's the first written account of Jesus that was produced and preserved and circulated all over the early church. Somewhere in the early 70s, late 60s, something like that. We start off with Jesus as an adult. Mark is not concerned with all of Jesus' life. He wants to tell the story of the climactic events of the last few years of his life. He's not trying to tell the whole story. None of the gospel authors want to tell the whole story. They want to give you what's relevant to the meaning and significance of Jesus. So look down in verse 16 of Mark 1. It's the story of Jesus calling his first followers. And verse 16, as Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw who? Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. So this is the first written account of Jesus of Nazareth. This is the first story of Jesus calling followers to himself. And who is the first follower of Jesus named? Simon, whose name was also known as Peter, Simon Peter. Turn the page. Chapter 3. Verse 13. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12, designating them apostles, which means sent ones, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach, to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed. Who's first in the list? Simon, who is also called Peter, and the other official kind of list of the 12. If you read through Mark's gospel, Simon Peter occurs more often and more frequently per chapter than in any of the other gospels. He's all over the place in the Gospel of Mark. Here's a little homework project. Go get a cup of tea later today and track this one out. Who's the last follower of Jesus to be named in the second to last sentence of Mark's Gospel? I'm throwing you a bone here. Simon Peter. It's the first written account of Jesus' ministry. Who's the first follower of Jesus named? Simon Peter. Who's the first in the list? Who appears all over the gospel more than any other? Who's the last disciple named? What is Mark doing? What's he trying to tell us? This is Mark's way of saying where he got his quilt pieces from. The Gospel of Mark is a distillation, essentially, of the eyewitness testimony of the guy whose name appears all over this gospel. So it's the same exact thing that Luke is saying. Mark was not a part of the earliest generation of Christians. He was not an eyewitness. Mark is a compiler, an arranger of Peter's eyewitness testimony. The quilt material is older than the quilt itself. You guys tracking with me here? Right? It's pretty cool. So this is great. It's actually really interesting. So in other words, the gap between the Gospels and Jesus is really sealed. It's full connection. Because the eyewitnesses, it's not like they just all like, Jesus passed from the scene, and then they just kind of like never talked about it again. And then 40 to 60 years later, they're like, okay, we should probably write this down. Okay, what was Jesus wearing that day? Like a brown tunic or a tan tunic or, the one blind man, two blind men? No. for this whole period of 40 to 60 years, the circle of Jesus' followers were going around telling, retelling the stories of Jesus for the whole way. And then the gospel authors consult those eyewitnesses to compose their accounts. So really, this whole idea that there were no eyewitnesses or that there's no eyewitness access to Jesus, it really just falls to the ground completely. We do have eyewitness testimony. Just so you know, I'm not making all this up, two scholars who have kind of put meat to all of this argument. One guy is actually not even a Bible scholar at all. His book has nothing to do with the Bible. You'll see him up here on the screen. He was a professor here at UW. His name is Jan van Sina. And he did ethnographic studies of a number of cultures and villages in sub-Saharan Africa. And he traced how they preserve memories of the story of their village or of their tribe. And what he found across the board is that cultures that pass on oral history like this, they set up mechanisms to make sure that eyewitness testimony is preserved and corrected, and that they do distinguish between legend and history. More recently, a scholar who's applied Van Sina's work to the Gospels and how the Gospels were made is this guy named Richard Bauckham. If you love to slog through 500 pages of dense historical work, Bauckham's book is going to be what you want. I'm sure it's going to make the bestseller list, you know. But these scholars, this is not, I'm just making this up. This is out there, and this is where the discussion is at in scholarship. So this whole notion of a gap between the eyewitnesses and Jesus, it doesn't really exist. The eyewitnesses were there the whole time. Pause. If this is interesting to you, this whole issue of how biblical books were made and how they were passed down and collected, we have these things here at Blackhawk. We offer them kind of throughout the year called journey classes. Matt Metzger mentioned one last week on evangelism. The other one is a class I teach called Bible in the Making. And if this is your idea of fun, we're going to take a whole Saturday morning and just go right at these issues. How were the biblical books made? How were they collected into the Bible? It's going to be awesome. 2 weeks, Saturday morning. You can find information on your bulletin, sign up online. My shameless self-promotion of my class is over. The Gospels preserve eyewitness testimony. Okay, let's press the question even further. Okay, let's say they do come from eyewitnesses. How do we know that the eyewitnesses didn't just fabricate legends to promote their religious agenda? Isn't it possible that they could have made this up right from the very beginning to promote their deal? Is this possible? Totally possible. It's totally possible. Of course it is. But that's not the question. The question is it probable? Is it likely? Given what we do have in the Gospels. How do we get at this question? There's a scholar at Notre Dame named John Meyer who's producing, well, he's now on like page 3,000 of his multi-volume work. It's called A Marginal Jew, and he is overturning every sentence in the Gospels with history and archaeology and working through all the historical issues in the Gospels. Good reading if you need to go to sleep at night or something. He's developed this argument. It's an older, he didn't make it up, but he's kind of refurbished it. He calls it the criterion of embarrassment. Follow me here. This is really interesting. He says, the early church would have hardly gone out of its way to create material that only embarrassed its creator, Jesus, or weakened its position in arguments with opponents. So what's he saying? He's saying, if you look at the Gospels and the stories that they tell, if a story would, in telling it in public, discredit Jesus or embarrass the early church to have to tell this story about Jesus, then it's really improbable that that would have been fabricated or made up. For example, Jesus included within the inner circle of his followers a significant number of women. We read that and we think, well, that's awesome. That's great. In the first century, as a patriarchal, traditional culture, That would be a discredit to Jesus' reputation. Why? Because women were seen as a subordinate. They had a lower status. And for Jesus to include women and treat them as equal as men among his followers, that would be a discredit to Jesus in the eyes of the public. Even more so. The foundational event of the Christian story, the resurrection of Jesus, in all four gospel accounts, who were the first eyewitnesses to the empty tomb and the risen Jesus? Women. If you were looking to convince people of the story of the resurrection, you would never make up this story in the first century. In some cultures and in some parts of Judaism, women's testimony in court wasn't even accepted because it was inherently invalid because of the gender. You would never, but all of the Gospels, the women were the first eyewitnesses. Let's say you were like an early Greek or a Roman, and you walk up to an early Christian. You're like, "Who's your God? Tell me about your God." And what would an early Christian say? Well, I believe in one God, the God of Israel, the God of the Scriptures, and I believe he became a human. What? It's ridiculous. Humans are weak and frail. Your God became a human? Yeah, and then he was arrested and beaten and tortured and then publicly executed by the Romans. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. This is an embarrassing story as you circulate it. We know it was embarrassing and that it brought ridicule on the early Christians. There's a fascinating ancient piece of graffiti that turned up in Rome about 100 years ago. It's called the Alexamenos graffiti, right? It wasn't done in spray paint, too bad. It's done by carving into the wall. So you've got a guy here, he's raising his hand in worship. This graffiti dates to somewhere in the late 100s, early 200s AD. He's raising his hand in worship to a human figure with a donkey head. What's happening to this human figure with the donkey head? He's being crucified. That's Jesus. So, and of course, the joke is, oh yeah, Alexamenos, yeah, he's worshiping his God. The notion that your religious leader was a failed, executed Messiah, killed by the Romans, this is not a way to make friends and influence people. You know what I'm saying? This is a ridiculous story. Why would the early Christians fabricate and perpetuate this story unless it actually relates their experience of what they saw and what happened? See, we come at this from 2,000 years later. Christianity has been influential and widespread. But back then, this was just a small minority group telling these stories. They had nothing to gain. They had everything to lose. And they did lose everything by telling these stories, the stories of this crucified and risen Savior who had changed their lives and was changing their communities. And they perpetuated these stories about Jesus that brought embarrassment on them. It's a criterion of embarrassment. Let's press the question even a little further. So, okay, all right, it's not likely that much of the material in the Gospels would have been fabricated, but come on. There's miracles. It's like Jesus turns water into wine, He heals people. Don't the presence of those stories themselves make the Gospels mythological or mythology or something? It's a great question. Usually what's happening here is the whole issue of miracles. This is really a complex discussion. This is about metaphysics and philosophy and so on. But usually what's happening is someone has already made up their mind that extraordinary events that have no seemingly natural explanation, if you've already made up your mind that those kinds of things can't happen or don't happen, and then you come to the Gospels, then of course these stories will seem ridiculous, of course. But it's because someone's already made up their mind about it. It's not because the Gospels are mythology. The scholar who's kind of done the landmark work here, his guy's name is Richard Burridge. He's a Cambridge scholar. And essentially in this work, what he's doing, this is my paraphrase, if you were to walk into an ancient Barnes & Nobles in the first century, where would you find the Gospels? Would you find them in fiction? religious fiction, or would you find them in the biography section, historical biography? And so he's a scholar of Greek and Roman classical literature, and he put together this very detailed profile. What did biographies look like in the ancient world? How long were they? How many words? What did they typically include? And point by point, the Gospels fit exactly that bill. They're not mythology. So if you've already made up your mind that extraordinary events cannot occur, then the discussion needs to take place there. But that doesn't mean that the Gospels are mythology. They're not. They're biographies making claims about this historical individual, Jesus of Nazareth, what he said and what he did. Okay, all right. I'll be the first to admit, right? I don't want you to get the impression that I'm up here like with no questions and that I'm certain about all of this. I'll be the first to admit that these stories about Jesus contain materials and events that are hard to believe. Some people in the room, you read the Gospels and it just kind of makes sense, and you're like, okay, it's not that hard for me to believe. But there are many of us, and I'm among their number, who do find this hard to believe. And we want to think it through historically, rigorously, logically. We should encourage that. But what happens is if we don't foster that environment, we give the impression that we just believe all of this just because we believe it. No, this stuff is hard to believe. We recognize that. And the basic point, I don't pretend to think that I've proven anything in like 25 minutes or something, or that I'm certain about all of this. I'm on a journey too, just like all of you. But I hope I've at least put out there some reasonable and what I think are compelling and defensible claims that the Gospels preserve eyewitness testimony. The Gospel authors are essentially saying this. They're putting this out there and they're saying, listen, you guys, I know this sounds crazy. I know this is hard to believe. This is what we saw. This is what we experienced. This is what Jesus of Nazareth said and did. And I know that it challenges everything you believe. I know it breaks your categories about what you think life is about and what you think the world is about. This is what we saw. This is what we believed. And they put the testimony before us, and it's our choice to accept or reject and to wrestle with their testimony. Let me close with a short story. It comes from a guy named J.P. Moreland. He's a Christian philosopher, and he tells the story of his graduate school days. One day when I was in graduate school, I was walking into the library and came across a student who was reading the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. You know, he saw that one on the bestseller list too. I went over to him and said, "What in the world are you doing?" He said, "I have a master's degree from UCLA in Greek classical literature, an undergraduate degree in classics from Harvard. I'm finishing my PhD in Greek classical literature from UCLA, and, I was reading Greek New Testament recently, like you do." The young man was Jewish. He went on to say, "I've become a committed follower of Jesus of Nazareth. I wanted to come over here to USC because I knew there were some Christian graduate students studying philosophy. I asked, 'How did you become a Christian?' He said, 'Mr. Moreland, I've studied ancient mythology most of my education. I know the earmarks of myth because that's all I study. My undergraduate training was in Greek mythology. My graduate training has been in mythology. I was practicing my Greek at one point in time by reading the Gospel of Luke. I got halfway through it and said, my God, this man really did these things. What am I going to do? This is history. It reads like history, not like myth. I know what myth tastes like because all I've done the last 10 years is study it, and the stories of Jesus are not myth.'" His response is entirely appropriate. And this is the bold claim that the gospel authors set in front of us. I know this sounds crazy. This is what we saw. This is what we experienced. It changes everything. And if this is true, my God, this man really did these things. What am I going to do? These Gospels demand a personal, whole life response if the testimony is actually true. That's the question that they put on our table. Let me close with a brief word of prayer. God, we thank you and we thank you that we don't have to believe in unicorns to embrace the testimony given us by those who encountered you in human flesh and blood. Lord, I pray for those of us, for myself, that have questions, we have doubts, we want to engage. God, would you guide us towards truth? Would you use the Q&A panel tonight to help guide us in that direction as well? We give all of this to you, and we can pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.